Airflow is the lifeblood of any computer system, and certainly air coolers are an elegant way to cool the brain of your system, your CPU. There's no coolant to leak, no tubes to wrangle, no mess of cables to connect. Nothing exudes more self-confidence than a big hunk of metal fins, heat pipes, and an attached fan. Heck, sometimes you might not even need that fan. Let's take a look at some of the best performing air coolers that you can put in the Cooler Master NR200. Hey there, and welcome back to Machines and More. I just wrapped up liquid AIO cooling in the last installment of our continuing look at the Cooler Master NR200, and I hope you all saw the excellent results we got from an intaking radiator. We're going to forge ahead in our discussion and explore air cooler selection today. Typically speaking, liquid AIO systems perform very similarly, with the difference coming from the thickness of the radiator and the quality of the fans. While a lot of attention is placed to the pump head and RGB lighting, the fact is that liquid doesn't have to move very fast for effective cooling to occur. Radiator designs are fairly similar, and stock fans generally represent the same level of mediocrity, so performance variation from a liquid AIO system isn't huge. Now when it comes to air coolers, however, things like heatsink mass, heat pipe design, form factor, fin density, airflow direction, and yes, fan quality can all vary, and the combination of these factors lead to meaningful differences. The Cooler Master NR200 has one limiting factor that restricts builders from choosing the hugest heatsinks, and that's the official height limitation of 155 millimeters. And while there's enough flex and tolerance from the side panel to fit some coolers taller than that, there's really no way to fit a large dual tower cooler such as a Noctua D15S or a Be Quiet Dark Rock Pro 4, which are simply too tall. Now with that restriction, I've picked out 4 of the larger coolers that should fit in the NR200 for discussion, keeping in mind that 2 of these are officially out of spec. These coolers represent the best case scenario that one could expect from air cooling in this case. I might take a look at some mid-tier coolers later on, but it's good to know what the maximum level of air cooling can be. I'll be looking at the Noctua U12S, Noctua U12A, Noctua C14S, and the Scythe Fuma 2. Yes, many of these are Noctua since they pretty much occupy the high end when it comes to tower coolers. And I did want to give a big thank you to all of you out there that recommended these for testing. I did also consider the Dark Rock 4, but since the official height is 159.5 millimeters, I chose to skip it since 158mm really seems like it's the limit, and you'll see why shortly when we take a look at the U12S. The Pure Rock 2 Slim was also on the table, but the U12S is already the weakest contender for this comparison, and it already bests it in raw performance. So there's no good reason for inclusion into the roundup, at least for the high-end coolers. If I've missed a high-end cooler that you think will fit, please let me know in the comments down below, and we can always do a part 2 later on in the future. I've gone through some of the viable configurations for air cooling in this case in the video linked up here. So if you haven't checked it out yet, it would be a good jumping off point for this comparison. Before we get into the details on the coolers, however, I did want to add 2 configurations for consideration. Now, just to clarify, when I say intake orientation, that means ingesting cooler air from the back or the sides. And exhaust means expelling hot air out the back or out the sides. My initial build in this case was with the Noctua U12A, and I was not able to fit the 92mm fan at the rear. But what I didn't remember was that the cooler is slightly offset, and by rotating it, the 92mm fan could be accommodated. Thus, I retested the intake orientation with the 92mm case fan to see if the 92mm fan feeding the U12A's NFA12 fan would result in any meaningful difference. One thing to note is that this will only work with low-profile RAM since this orientation will interfere with RAM on most mini-itx boards. Did the fan help? It did not. At best, it was within measurement error, but it made things worse while adding noise to the system. What's happening is that the fan is actually inhibiting the intake for the U12A because the 92mm fan is inhibiting the airflow path for the larger fan. And while in theory having a fan should help, the only way for it to do that reasonably is that it has to at least exceed the airflow of the CPU cooler fan. Now the 92mm fan is rated at 40 CFM max, and the fact of the matter is that to move enough air, it would have to spin considerably faster compared to the NF-A12, which would generate more noise. And at the rate the NF-A12s would be running at during an overclocking load, the 92mm fan wouldn't be able to catch up, since its theoretical max is about the same amount of air moved by the NF-A12 at around 60 to 70% PWM. So at that point, you would have a 92mm fan running at 100% and the noise penalty would be extreme. So long story short, even though it could fit with the U12A, it's not a good pairing. Realistically, the best way to do this is with similar sized fans, so 120mm at the back would make more of a difference in this test. Owing to that, I would just omit it from most configurations, since at best, it does no harm, while causing additional noise. Now second, for the first air cooling optimization video, I tested bottom fans on the exhaust direction, which helped GPU thermals marginally. Because of the meager gain, I skipped testing the bottom fans for the remaining configurations, but recently I went back and tested bottom fans on the intake direction again, seeing how much it helped in the AIO testing when the GPU was running in a ball of hot exhaust air. Now it did help, but since the test without bottom fans was already poor to begin with, it only slightly pulled ahead of the exhaust orientation, with slightly worse CPU temps. It's a reasonable configuration for overall thermals, but keep in mind that there is noise and cost gain from 2 additional fans, where the exhaust orientation with 2 top fans appears to accomplish more or less the same thing. With that out of the way, let's dive into our 4 coolers. We'll take a look at the key features and specs of each cooler, and then do a thermals comparison between all of them. All of these coolers will fit LGA 11.5X, LGA 1200, AM3, and AM4 sockets, among many others. The first in our comparison is the Noctua NH-U12S. Prior to the introduction of the U12A, the U12S was the only 120mm tower cooler in Noctua's lineup for consumer-grade CPUs. Now there was previously a U12, which was a more basic design with fewer heat pipes. This guy features a 120mm NF-F12 fan, which is a good performing static pressure fan that retails for $20. The fan does top out at 1500 RPM, thus limiting its theoretical thermal headroom, although even at max RPM it only hits about 43 decibels. It retails for around $60, and there's a Chromax version for $10 more. Now, since Noctua does not provide a TDP rating, they simply indicate that at least for the 3700X that I'll be testing with, that it has the best turbo overclocking headroom. The U12S is slimmer than the U12A. It has similar fin density of roughly 12 fins per inch and 5 heat pipes that loop into the heat fins twice, or dual loop. You'll see 10 terminations at the top of the heatsink. Now this heatsink weighed in at roughly 560 grams. There is a second version of the U12S called the U12SE-AM4, which is basically the same thing but with specific hardware for AM4 sockets. It emits Intel mounting hardware to include specific hardware for AM4, adding in these brackets to be able to mount the U12S perpendicular to your RAM. Now specific to fit in the NR200, it marginally fits. Even though the panel will close, the plastic clips don't provide enough leverage to hold it down. You will need to use screws to secure the panel from the inside. It's too wide to allow a top case fan directly over it. The stock NR200 grill does not fit, and although a grill-less fan could be mounted, the blades made intermittent contact with the heatsink, which is not a good thing. There's no concern with the 92mm case fan, which fits just fine. And this is the only heatsink out of the ones that I tested that could take a decorative optional heatsink cover plate, which unfortunately won't fit in the NR200 but is applicable to cases that have more cooler height tolerance. Next up, the bigger and newer sibling of the U12S, the Noctua NH-U12A. As of the time of filming, the U12A is the newest cooler in Noctua's lineup if you exclude special editions and black finish Chromax colorways. Instead of the NF-A12 that the U12S comes with, it comes with 2 best-in-class NF-A12s, intended to be operated in a push-pull orientation, along with a fan splitter cable to allow the PWM signal to be sent to both fans. Now, these fans can go up to 2000 RPM at 100% PWM, and at that point there is a lot of air being moved around, so these fans will give a generous amount of overclocking headroom. In the stock setup, one fan pushes air and the other pulls it through on the other end. Now, it is the most expensive cooler out of the box at $100 USD MSRP. It adds an additional 2 dual loop heat pipes along with a thicker heat sink, therefore resulting in more heat sink mass at roughly 740 grams, or about 32% heavier. Now, it's the same height as the U12S at 158 millimeters. Now, on paper, the heatsink is already better before you even consider the fans. Noctua also rates this as best for overclocking headroom for the 3700X. Now, just how much better is it? I did a quick check by putting the NF-A12 fans in the same push-pull orientation, and the gap was about 3.6 degrees at an all-core stock clock on the 3700X. Now, that translates to about a 12% difference from going from the U12S to the U12A. When noise normalized, comparing fans only, the NF-F12 runs about a degree worse than the NF-A12, since the A12s are moving more air at the same noise level. Thus, the U12A is better in two ways: the fans and also the heatsink. Cost-wise, comparing to the U12S, you're basically getting a $40 heatsink with a $20 fan in the U12S, and getting a $40 heatsink with two $30 fans in the U12A. So to some extent, the U12A is a better value from the better heatsink, though of course, you have to get two NF-A12s along with it. As for fit in the NR200, it does not officially fall under that 155mm height limit, but I had no issues other than the fact that the panel is right up against the heat pipe tips. I found it odd that the U12S had more of a clearance issue than the U12A, but the offending heat pipes are higher up, possibly causing more pressure towards the top of the panel, where it can't flex as much to accommodate. On paper, these two coolers are supposed to be the same width of 125mm, but the U12A, at least the one I tested, is ever so slightly less than the manufacturer's specification, and that 3 to 4mm makes all the difference when fitting a top case fan over it, which it does allow. It does also depend on your motherboard's CPU socket position though. Some motherboards have their CPU socket higher up, and that may prevent a top case fan from mounting, so your mileage may vary. Depending on your motherboard, you may have to rotate the cooler and use low-profile RAM if you want to use a 92mm fan, although, as demonstrated earlier, there's no real point in installing it for this push-pull cooler. The two Noctuas use Noctua's Scythe Fuma mounting system, which consists of mounting bars that mount to either the standard AM4 plate included with the motherboards, or an included Intel plate. The bars are elevated off of the motherboard PCB via plastic spacers, and the heatsinks mount to the two mounting studs on the bars. Neither of these two Noctuas will allow the HDD/radiator panel to be used. Now, this next cooler is one that is officially compatible with the NR200. It's the only dual tower design I am testing here, since the other dual tower designs such as the Noctua D9 are in a lower tier due to its smaller size and smaller fan. The heatsink weighs in at about 750 grams. I measured and counted a half fin less per inch than the U12A, so around 11.5. And it has 6 heat pipes compared to the U12A's 7. So at least on a heatsink basis, it appears to be closely matched with the U12A. It retails for the same as the Noctua U12S at roughly $60 USD. Scythe doesn't give a TDP rating either, however, it seems to suggest that this is suitable for overclocking even high TDP processors such as the 9900K, 3950X, and so on. It ships with 220mm fans. The first one is the Kaze Flex at 25mm thick, and the other one is the Kaze Flex Slim at 15mm thick. And it also comes with an extra set of clips for 25mm fans if you have the RAM clearance to run a standard thickness fan. Now, interestingly, the fans rotate in opposite directions. Scythe suggests in their instructions that this increases static pressure performance. It's not a true push-pull setup since one fan is pushing and the middle one is pushing and pulling. And there's also a small gap in between the two fans as well, so there is some case air that will be drawn in through the middle gap. At any rate, it is a bit odd to use two dissimilar fans in a dual tower cooler. It's not the optimal arrangement, but this is a concession in order to accommodate taller RAM modules. The other end of the heatsink is notched out in order to clear RAM on motherboards which have RAM mounted there, or in the mini-itx scenario, it doesn't do anything. The heat fins have an interesting design where instead of being flush with each other, every other heat fin is staggered lower and also serrated. Presumably this is to increase airflow performance by changing the characteristics of the airflow. I also really liked how the heat fins featured a thoughtful cutout that made positioning the fans very easy and very pleasant. The mounting hardware is similar to that from the two aforementioned Noctuas, in that there are mounting bars that affix to a standard AM4 plate or an included Intel mounting plate, and plastic spacers elevate the mounting bars off of the PCB. The heatsink then also attaches via two mounting screws which thread on the bars. This set comes with one of the nicest screwdrivers that I've seen included with a CPU cooler. It is a real elongated screwdriver complete with a plastic handle, and it'll also come in handy for your PC building toolkit, so it's pretty nice. A fan splitter cable is included for the two fans. Unfortunately though, there is a significant issue holding this cooler back. Instead of including two low noise adapters along with fans that have a full RPM range, the side fans included here are capped at 1200 RPM by default. So there's no way to unlock higher fan speed, even though I would think these fans are capable of it. This is likely a way to make their cooler sound quieter out of the box to the average user without involving any user intervention. I know that most power users would prefer to have a fully powered fan and just set the fan curves in BIOS. The limited fans means that while it is competent at stock clocks, it is only capable of a very mild overclock, and because of this, I could only test all core stock clock comparisons for the cooler in the out-of-box configuration. For review completeness on the heatsink itself though, I did throw in two Noctua NF-A12s on this heatsink just to evaluate how good the heatsink was, and if any design on the heatsink would pose issues related to combined GPU and CPU testing. Now, specific to the NR200, it fits without any side panel interference. However, the HDD panel still will not mount due to the heat pipes. The design of the cooler also prevents both a second case fan from mounting at the top, and it is too thick for the 92mm case fan. Lastly, I check out the only top-down, or I guess you could also do it bottom-up, cooler in this test, the Noctua C14S. This cooler retails at about $75 US and features the biggest fan in the testing today, which is a 140mm A14. All the other coolers tested utilize airflow across the motherboard instead of towards or away from it. Now, Noctua rates this as moderate overclocking headroom for the 3700X. The C14S also has the heaviest heatsink in our testing, featuring approximately 800 grams of 12 fins per inch high-quality aluminum heat fins, as well as copper heat pipes and baseplate. The design is very different compared to the U12A, but it still has 7 heat pipes though, and because of the design, they only loop into the heat fins once, so you'll only see 7 terminations at the end of the heat fins. The A14 fan is intended to be mounted to the top, and although it technically can be mounted underneath the heatsink in a low profile mode, with the mini-itx board you can only run a 120mm fan underneath, which I did test as a push-pull with the A14. The only way to use the A14 fan in this case is to mount it on top, which is the default configuration, so it'll either pull air away from the board or blow it towards the board. And the heatsink can only be installed in one orientation. I tried to play around with it for 92mm fan compatibility, but if you rotated it, it would stick out past the rear I/O. And with the fan on top, the height is a little over 140mm, which is completely compatible with the NR200's 155mm height restriction. Now, motherboard cooling is an added benefit where case airflow is not optimal. However, it's really not a big deal in the NR200 since the bottom to top airflow is quite good. In the NR200, this cooler also has the advantage of allowing the HDD panel, and this is the only tested cooler to allow that. It does only allow the use of one 3.5-inch HDD because mounting on the PSU shroud is not going to work due to the position of the heatsink. You can marginally fit it on the HDD panel though. You will only get 2 screws if you have the A14 fan mounted on top of the heatsink. One additional configuration I tested was putting the A14 fan directly on the HDD panel, meaning it was pulling cool air directly from outside. I also used an NF-A12 on the underside to pull that cool air through the heatsink towards the motherboard, and we'll see how that performs shortly. Now, all of these coolers tested use a nickel-plated copper base plate along with nickel-plated copper heat pipes. So let's do a quick recap of the key specs for each cooler. And with that, let's dive into the testing results in the NR200. Similar to the other cooler tests I've done on the NR200, I'm using Blender's Classroom Render and a 3700X clock to 3.6 GHz all-core at 1.05 volts for the stock clock tests. For overclocking and CPU-only tests, it is boosted to 4.3 GHz at 1.25 volts. And for the combined CPU and GPU test, it's running at 4.2 GHz on 1.2 volts, while running Unison Heaven 4.0 on a Zotac 1660 Super Amp. Fan speeds were targeted for each cooler by fixing fan RPMs with a fan controller as follows. 44 decibels for the stock clocks, 47 decibels for the overclock test, and 51 decibels for the overclock CPU plus Unison tests. Though higher than what I would personally target for real-world use, this does allow the CPU to hit those high clocks and actually complete the tests, which are on the extreme end of typical computing usage. I'll give the results from the best orientation within the NR200. At stock clocks with out-of-the-box fans targeting roughly 44 decibels, the exhaust configuration U12A comes in ahead of the pack, slightly ahead of the intaking C14S. The intaking stock config Fuma 2 is third, and the U12S comes in last. It could not reach the noise target. The U12A has low temps and a low noise level to boot, although it certainly needs to, given that this is the highest priced cooler here. At $60, the Fuma 2 certainly impresses, as it's certainly not, by any measure, 40% worse than the U12A. However, the Kaze Flex fans and the U12S's NF-F12 were at 100% PWM here, so there really is no way to give either of these cooler any additional thermal headroom. Adding 2 NF-A12s to the Fuma 2 further improves at 0.8 degrees, while maintaining the same noise levels. Adding 2 NF-A12s to the U12S improves at 2 degrees, but noise levels increase from having an additional fan added. Now, despite the improvement, it's still worse performing than the out-of-box Scythe Fuma 2. So what we can see here is that there is no substitute for a large heatsink body and more heat pipes. Fans help, but to a point. Now, moving on to the overclock scenarios, out of the box, only 2 coolers managed to allow the 3700X to complete the render at 4.3 GHz on 1.25 volts. Going to this point requires sufficient thermal headroom, and the U12A and C14S are toe-to-toe. The C14S was impressive as it was only operating off of just one fan, although this was a noisier 140mm A14 fan. Throwing in some modded testing, we can see that an NF-A12 fan addition and moving the A14 effectively onto the side panel allows the C14S to move ahead of the U12A a fraction, albeit at a higher noise level. Now, for this configuration, you need to make sure that both fans run off of the same fan header or are tuned via a fan controller, since you do need to ensure that they work in lockstep, so that air gets pulled in evenly through the panel instead of the fans interfering with each other. The addition of NF-A12s to the Fuma 2 also allows the Fuma 2 to compete effectively, indicating that the Fuma 2 is held back by its fans, and more specifically, the fact that they are RPM limited fans. For the out-of-the-box tests, including Heaven 4.0, I tested the U12A and C14S, seeing that they were the ones to finish the overclock test successfully. The U12A was ahead again here, both slightly ahead for CPU thermals, but really ahead for GPU thermals by almost 4 degrees. The exhausting direction of the U12A really helps GPU thermals a lot. Now, throwing in some modded scenarios, the C14S with a rad panel mounted A14 intake helped CPU thermals slightly, with more or less the same GPU temps. The Scythe Fuma 2 with the fan upgrade can compete with the others, however the U12A still bests it in both CPU, GPU, and noise levels. So how much do bottom fans help? If you recall in our initial air cooling configuration evaluation, both bottom fans did not help the GPU too much for exhausting tower coolers. And the reason is that exhausting tower coolers are already helping the GPU significantly by drafting away their hot exhaust. And the addition of bottom fans just trades more CPU thermals for some GPU thermals. For intaking tower coolers, however, there is a significant difference. Bottom fans do help intaking tower coolers, but they do add about 0.5 to 1 decibel. For most of the tower coolers, running as an exhaust is already a pretty optimal scenario, even comparing against intake with bottom fans. So there really is less of an argument to run bottom fans when you're using an air cooler. They do really help the top-down C14S though, and it seems like to get an optimal result for the GPU with this cooler, one really needs to be running bottom fans. Alright, so that's it for the thermal data. So, can we pick a winner? Well, just because a cooler is flat out incredible doesn't necessarily mean it should win, since we all have different budgets and different use cases. Certainly though, at this point I can safely recommend that you shouldn't get the U12S, at least for use in the NR200. The smaller heatsink mass of the U12S just can't match the Scythe Fuma 2, even though it has a nicer fan that can run at a higher RPM. In the stock out-of-the-box configuration, the thermal results just don't match up, and I think for the same amount of money, it's really hard to recommend choosing the U12S over the Fuma 2 under any scenario. I'll single out a reasonable use case for the remaining 3 coolers here. The Scythe Fuma 2 is excellent at stock clocks and with the stock fans. It's hard to argue against the value here because it really presents an excellent argument for the average user that wants to maximize performance per dollar and doesn't mind staying around stock settings or stock clocks. Certainly it doesn't come out of the box equipped to take on chips like the 3700X to the highest overclocks, but the beauty of it is that it provides a heatsink that can scale with your usage. If needed, you can just upgrade the fans later on. If not, well, that's fine too, since it's very competitive at stock clocks. With 2 NFA12s, the total cost does become $120, but you also will have a 25mm fan and a slim fan you can play around with as case fans or some other application. Of course, there's not a big argument to use them as bottom fans if you run the cooler as an exhaust. Now, if your intention is to get the best overclocking performance, I would not recommend getting the Fuma 2 just to upgrade the fans right away, since realistically, you should be looking at the C14S or U12A, which are equipped out of the box, ready to go. So if your intention is to only ever run at stock clocks on moderate TDP chips like a 10600, a Ryzen 5, or stock Ryzen 7, the stock Fuma 2 should be high on your list, and there's simply no compelling reason to go with anything more expensive. The Noctua C14S is really interesting as the only top-down cooler on this test. It was usually a close second in the thermal testing to the U12A, though it did not fare quite as well in the combined CPU and GPU test without the help of bottom fans. Noctua does not rate it as highly as the U12S or U12A, but it handily beat the U12S, which honestly it should because it has a much larger heatsink and more heat pipes. Specific to the NR200, it has the advantage of being able to intake close to the side panel, with the best arrangement being the 140mm fan mounted on the rad panel, along with a 25mm fan pulling from the bottom. It's called a top-down cooler for a very good reason. I tested it as an exhaust and it performed terribly in the CPU and GPU test, with roughly the same GPU thermals and about 10 degrees worse for the CPU. I think for those interested in running a higher TDP CPU, this is the one to go for. You have the rad panel, which really adds some versatility to your build. And at only $15 more than the Scythe Fuma 2, It's an easy argument if you ever want to overclock a higher powered chip. It comes out of the box ready to hit hard, and I don't think the U12A is at any point 33% better than it. On top of that, if you're thinking of running a higher powered GPU, this is the one to get, since it is little affected by GPU exhaust, especially considering the Founders Edition 3080 Nvidia GPU. The airflow direction of this is ideal, since it allows better isolation of CPU and GPU thermal interdependence. By using the NF-A14 on the panel and an NF-A12 underneath, this setup pretty much guarantees the coolest air will reach your heatsink to cool your CPU. That 3080 will intake from the bottom and exhaust out the back, and also the top towards the back of the case. The C14S will intake from the side panel and exhaust towards the motherboard. In both scenarios, the exhausted air ends up around the motherboard without being taken in by either device, where the top case fan can then exhaust it out. Now, we really need to wait and see until the new GPUs are in hand, but this one looks really promising for use with that GPU. The reason it did not perform as well for GPU thermals as the U12A did was that the U12A had enough headroom to help out the GPU and still maintain great CPU temps, while the C14S pretty much just lets the GPU do its own thing while it does its own thing, which is why the bottom fans helped out the GPU thermals so much. To top it off, it could be a lot better yet. The biggest hindrance to its performance in this case was that it did not allow for the use of 92mm fans and the case fan directly above it. Both of those would significantly boost its performance, since those exhausts would quickly channel hot air away from the heatsink, allowing cool air to flow in quickly. The A14 fan did also seem louder when it was on the side panel, since the placement of the noise is closer to the outside of the case. One final note is that this cooler will absolutely not work well with the tempered glass panel, so if you're considering it for the NR200P or any tempered glass paneled case, this one is a scratch right away. It would be trying to draw air from a solid panel about a centimeter away, and that's just not going to work well. For a flat out best cooler in terms of CPU thermals, it's hats off to the U12A. It's the out of box champ and has the most headroom for overclocking right out of the box. It allows full top case fan compatibility, and though it can be rotated to run the 92mm case fan, the 92mm case fan doesn't help it out at all. In fact, it makes it worse. It comes with the best 120mm fans on the market, and there's really no meaningful upgrade that you can throw at this thing. For $100, it better be good. It's neck and neck with the typical 240mm AIO for CPU thermals, and it won't hold back your CPU performance much. For a no-holds-barred, performance-oriented, CPU-focused power user, this should be highest on your list. Now, the C14S does give us some tough competition at $25 less, but on a pure CPU thermals basis, the U12A is still a better cooler, primarily because of the excellent fans and a more or less comparable heatsink. Now, to get close, the C14S would need the addition of an NF-A12, which puts it over the $100 cost of the U12A. And even the souped up Fuma 2 with the same NF-A12 was no match for the stock U12A. This one is great for anyone building a workstation where a GPU might be used infrequently and CPU thermals are key. We will have to wait and see how the tower cooler orientation interacts with the 3080. However, I do think that the optimal orientation will change from an exhaust to an intake, simply because the GPU will be dumping half of its hot exhaust directly into the heatsink fan. So, which one do I think is the best for the NR200? Personally, I think the most important thing to consider in SFF cooling is how the CPU and GPU are interacting. It's all well and good if your CPU thermals and GPU thermals are fantastic on an open air test bench, but it's useless if they are simply trading heat off of one another in an SFF case. Everything is spaced closely together on a mini-itx board, and it's hard to isolate the effect of one on the other. All the coolers tested today will be playing tug-of-war with the GPU in this case, all except one, the C14S. Now, even though it often played second fiddle to the U12A for CPU thermals in its out-of-the-box configuration, we have to keep in mind that it is $25 cheaper, almost enough to fetch an NF-A12 for use as a pull fan underneath the heatsink. Now with that addition, it's beating the U12A for CPU thermals for only $5 more. With bottom fans for the GPU, it's trading blows with a 240mm AIO in its best configuration. The stock fan does have a more annoying noise pattern, so if you are noise sensitive, I would swap out the A14 for yet another NFA12, and there won't be much of a performance change. This cooler is fantastic for this case because it's basically the honey badger of air coolers in the NR200. It doesn't care how the GPU is dumping its hot air, all it wants to do is pull cool air from the side panel. It allows multiple configurations, allows use of the HDD panel, allows another side fan next to it, and really should be the go-to if you are interested in the high heat GPU like a 5700 XT, 2080 Ti, or the upcoming 3080. Big Navi won't be a problem for it because C14S doesn't care. The hotter your GPU gets, the more adversely your typical tower cooler will be impacted. But not so with this. You can use bottom fans to boost the GPU's performance and it still doesn't care. It would be even better with full fan compatibility in this case, but frankly, it doesn't need them to be the best air cooler for the NR200. The airflow pattern is similar to the optimal configuration of a side-mounted AIO, and as such, it represents the best air cooler for this case. I know I've enjoyed seeing what's possible with air cooling in this case, and I hope you've enjoyed this roundup too. I'll revisit the C14S and U12A when the new Nvidia cards arrive, and I'm sure there'll be more to come with some mid-tier and even some lower profile air coolers. But we've started with the most extreme end of the performance spectrum so that you know just where the highest end of air cooler performance is in the Cooler Master NR200. If you've enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and please consider supporting the channel by using the links down below for any product purchases off of Amazon, or if you're purchasing any of these coolers today. Thanks for tuning in, and I hope you have a safe and healthy one, and see you all again soon.